12 R&B stars who suffered follow-up AIDS deaths. AIDS swept through humanity like a merciless plague, sparing no class or degree of superstardom. One unsterilized needle or whispered midnight encounter behind closed doors was all it took for an unforgiving invader to begin draining away life. Inside the platinum-soaked kingdom of 80s and 90s R&B, deception masked the tragedy. While these vocal superstars commanded sold-out arenas under blinding spotlights, they quietly wasted away in private. Paralyzed by public stigma, they guarded their diagnoses like state secrets, forcing families to fabricate death certificates. Today on Black Hollywood Uncut, we expose the harrowing truth behind 12 R&B legends who once owned the airwaves. Subscribe and hit that notification bell. Watch until the very end, because the shocking cover-ups on our countdown will leave you speechless. Fela Kuti, die age 58, in 1997. Fela Kuti was not just a musician. He was a storm, a rebel, and a voice that millions across Africa and beyond could not ignore. Born in Nigeria, he became the creator of Afrobeat, a fearless blend of jazz, funk, highlife, and political fire. Every time Fela stepped on stage, it felt less like a concert and more like a revolution. His music did not simply entertain people. It challenged power, questioned corruption, and gave ordinary citizens the courage to speak. But behind that powerful image was a man living under constant pressure. Fela's life was filled with battles against government authorities, public controversy, arrests, and personal chaos. He built a world around music, activism, and freedom, but that freedom also came with a heavy cost. The same fearless spirit that made him legendary also made his private life difficult to control. While fans saw the untouchable icon, those close to him saw a man whose health was slowly declining. In the final years of his life, Fela's body began to weaken. His energy faded, and the fiery performer who once commanded crowds for hours was no longer the same. Yet even as illness followed him, Fela remained a symbol of resistance. He had spent his life refusing to bow, refusing to soften his message, and refusing to let fear decide his identity. On August 2, 1997, Fela Kuti died in Lagos at the age of 58. His brother, Dr. Olikoye Ransome Kuti, later announced that Fela had died from complications related to AIDS. The news shocked many fans, not only because Fela was gone, but because it revealed a painful truth about an era when HIV and AIDS were still surrounded by silence, stigma, and fear. Fela's death was not just the end of a music career. It was the fall of a cultural giant. He left behind songs that still sound alive, still angry, still fearless. His body was gone, but his voice never disappeared. And that is why Fela Kuti remains unforgettable. Not because he lived a perfect life, but because he lived loudly, dangerously, and honestly enough to change music forever. Eric Eazy-E Wright died age 30 in 1995. Eric Eazy-E Wright was not just another rapper from Compton. He was one of the voices that changed hip-hop forever. With NWA and Ruthless Records, Eazy-E helped bring West Coast rap into the center of American culture. His voice was sharp, rebellious, and impossible to ignore. He did not sound polished or safe, and that was exactly why people listened. He represented the streets with a rawness that shocked parents, angered critics, and made millions of young fans feel seen. At the height of his fame, Eazy-E seemed untouchable. He had money, influence, controversy, and the kind of name recognition most artists only dream about. But behind the image of confidence was a danger no one around him fully understood. In early 1995, he began suffering from serious breathing problems. At first, many thought it was asthma or a lung issue. But when doctors examined him, the truth was far more devastating. Eazy-E had AIDS. The news hit the music world like a bomb. At that time, HIV and AIDS were still surrounded by fear, stigma, and misinformation, especially in hip-hop culture, where image and toughness mattered deeply. Eazy-E's diagnosis forced a conversation many people had been avoiding. Suddenly, AIDS was not just something whispered about in the background. It had taken one of rap's most famous and controversial figures. On March 16, 1995, Eazy-E publicly announced his condition. In that final message, he warned young people to take the disease seriously. Less than 2 weeks later, on March 26, 1995, Eric Wright died in Los Angeles at the age of 30. His death was fast, shocking, and unforgettable. Fans who had watched him dominate music could barely believe he was gone. 1 month earlier, he was still a living symbol of gangsta rap's rise. Then, suddenly, he became a warning about how fragile life can be, even for someone who looks powerful from the outside. Eazy-E left behind more than songs. He left behind a cultural earthquake. His music helped shape an entire era, but his death forced the world to confront a painful truth. Fame cannot protect anyone from disease, silence, or consequence. His voice may have stopped in 1995, but his impact still echoes through hip-hop today. Alvin Ailey, die age 58. In 1989, Alvin Ailey was not simply a dancer. He was a visionary who turned movement into memory, pain into beauty, and Black history into something the world could feel without a single word being spoken. Born in Texas, Ailey grew up carrying the weight of poverty, racism, and loneliness. But from those early struggles, he created a language of dance that would travel far beyond America. When he founded Alvin Ailey American Dance Theater, he did more than build a company. He built a home for Black dancers at a time when many doors were still closed to them. His masterpiece, Revelations, became one of the most beloved works in modern dance history. It carried the sound of spirituals, the sorrow of survival, and the strength of generations who had endured far more than the stage could ever fully show. To audiences, Ailey appeared powerful, elegant, and almost untouchable. But behind the curtain, his life was far more complicated. He carried deep emotional battles, the pressure of leadership, and the burden of living during a time when being Black, queer, and vulnerable could invite judgment from every direction. He gave the world beauty, but often kept his own pain hidden. By the late 1980s, Ailey's health began to fail. His body weakened, and those close to him understood that something serious was happening. Still, because AIDS carried enormous stigma at that time, the truth was not openly shared. When Alvin Ailey died on December 1, 1989, at the age of 58, the public explanation was a blood disorder. Later, it became known that he had died from AIDS-related complications. That detail makes his ending even more heartbreaking. A man who had spent his life giving dignity and visibility to others still had to face a final chapter, shaped by silence and shame. But AIDS did not erase Alvin Ailey. It did not erase his work, his company, or the generations of dancers who found power through his vision. Alvin Ailey's death was a loss to the arts, but his legacy became even larger after he was gone. He proved that dance could carry history, identity, and resistance. His body left the stage in 1989, but every performance of his work still feels like he is speaking, softly, powerfully, and forever. Sylvester died, age 41, in 1988. Sylvester was not just a singer with a beautiful voice. He was a force of nature. With his soaring falsetto, fearless stage presence, and glamorous style, Sylvester became one of the brightest figures of the disco era. He did not simply perform music. He created an atmosphere. When he sang, the room changed. People danced harder, smiled wider, and felt freer, even if only for a few minutes under the lights. Born Sylvester James Jr., he rose from church music roots into the electric nightlife of San Francisco, where disco, soul, and liberation moved together. His biggest hit, You Make Me Feel, turned him into an international name. For many fans, especially in queer and Black communities, Sylvester represented more than fame. He represented courage. He stood on stage as himself, at a time when doing so could invite cruelty, judgment, and rejection. But the same world that celebrated him also carried danger. By the 1980s, AIDS was spreading through communities that were already being ignored, misunderstood, and blamed. Fear grew faster than compassion. People whispered, friends disappeared. Artists got sick in silence, because the public often treated illness like a scandal instead of a human tragedy. As Sylvester's health declined, the transformation was heartbreaking. The powerful performer who once filled dance floors with life began to lose strength. His body weakened, his public appearances became harder, and the joyful image fans remembered was slowly replaced by the reality of a man fighting a devastating illness. Yet even as AIDS took its toll, Sylvester did not turn his final chapter into silence. On December 16, 1988, Sylvester died at the age of 41 from AIDS-related complications. His death was a painful loss, but what he did before leaving made his legacy even stronger. He openly acknowledged the disease and reportedly directed royalties from his work toward AIDS-related causes, especially to help communities that had been overlooked. Sylvester's story is not only about tragedy, it is about brilliance, identity, and bravery. AIDS took his body, but it could not erase the freedom he gave to the people who heard him sing. His voice still feels alive because it carried something rare: joy in the face of judgment, beauty in the face of fear, and truth in a world that often tried to look away. Bobby DeBarge, die, age 39, in 1995. Bobby DeBarge had the kind of voice people do not forget: smooth, emotional, and almost weightless. His falsetto helped define the sound of Switch, and later became part of the musical foundation behind the DeBarge family legacy. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, Bobby was more than a talented singer. He was a rising star, with the rare ability to make pain sound beautiful and romance feel almost spiritual. As a member of Switch, Bobby helped bring elegance and emotion into funk, soul, and R&B. Songs like There'll Never Be and I Call Your Name showed the depth of his gift. His voice could glide above the music, fragile and powerful at the same time. To listeners, he sounded untouchable. But away from the microphone, Bobby's life was far more troubled than the music suggested. Behind the fame, he battled addiction, instability, and personal wounds that followed him for years. His talent opened doors, but his struggles kept pulling him back into darkness. The same man who could move audiences with one note was also fighting battles that fame could not fix. Drugs, legal problems, and emotional pain slowly damaged both his career and his health. By the early 1990s, Bobby's condition had become serious. After years of decline, he was diagnosed with AIDS. For an artist already weakened by addiction and hardship, the illness became another cruel weight on a body that had endured too much. During that era, AIDS was still surrounded by shame and fear, and many entertainers faced the disease quietly, without the support or public understanding they deserved. On August 16, 1995, Bobby DeBarge died at the age of 39 from AIDS-related complications. His passing was devastating because it felt like the final chapter of a life filled with both genius and pain. He had given R&B one of its most haunting voices, yet his own story ended far too early. Bobby DeBarge's legacy is complicated, but that is what makes it human. He was not a perfect figure, and his life was not a clean success story. He was gifted, wounded, loved, and lost. His music remains, because it came from a place that felt real. Even after his death, Bobby's voice still carries the emotion of a man who sang beautifully while quietly breaking inside. Jermaine Stewart died age 39 in 1997. Jermaine Stewart was the kind of artist who could light up a room before he even sang a note. With his bright smile, stylish look, and playful confidence, he became one of the most recognizable voices of the 1980s. His biggest hit, We Don't Have to Take Our Clothes Off, was more than just a catchy song. It carried charm, innocence, and a message that stood out in an era often driven by excess. Jermaine made people dance, but he also made them listen. Born in Ohio and raised around music and performance, Jermaine found his way into the entertainment world through dance, television appearances, and eventually recording. When fame arrived, it came fast. Suddenly, he was on radio, on television, and in front of audiences who saw him as a fresh, joyful figure in pop and R&B. His image was clean, colorful, and full of life. To fans, he looked like someone who had everything ahead of him. But fame can be cruel when the spotlight begins to move away. As music trends changed, Jermaine's commercial success slowed. The same industry that once celebrated him became quieter. For many artists, that silence can be more painful than criticism. Behind the scenes, Jermaine faced personal struggles and health problems that the public did not fully understand. By the 1990s, his condition became more serious. At a time when HIV and AIDS were still surrounded by fear and stigma, many performers chose silence because the world often judged before it showed compassion. Jermaine's illness was not just a private battle. It was part of a larger tragedy that affected countless artists who were forced to suffer quietly while protecting their dignity. On March 17, 1997, Jermaine Stewart died at the age of 39. His death was linked to AIDS-related liver cancer, a heartbreaking ending for an artist whose music had once sounded so full of youth and freedom. What makes Jermaine's story so emotional is the contrast between his public image and his final years. He gave the world a song about respect, restraint, and self-worth, yet he lived in an industry and society that did not always offer the same kindness back to him. Still, Jermaine Stewart should not be remembered only for the illness that took him. He should be remembered for the joy he created, the confidence he carried, and the song that still makes people smile decades after his voice went silent. Willie Smith died age 39 in 1987. Willie Smith was not a singer, but his influence moved through music, street culture, fashion, and black creativity in a way few designers ever achieved. He was one of the most important American fashion figures of the 1980s, a visionary who believed style should not belong only to the wealthy or the elite. Through his brand WillieWear, he helped bring relaxed, colorful, street-inspired clothing into the mainstream and changed how people thought about everyday fashion. At a time when many designers were chasing luxury and exclusivity, Willie Smith moved in a different direction. He wanted clothes to feel alive. He wanted them to move with real people, on real streets, in real cities. His designs carried the rhythm of New York, the attitude of youth culture, and the freedom of people who wanted to express themselves without asking permission. That is why his work connected so naturally with the worlds of music, dance, and art. Willie's rise was impressive because he was not simply building a fashion label, he was building a cultural language. His clothes felt accessible, but still stylish, casual, but still bold. He understood that fashion was not just about fabric, it was about identity. For many young black creatives, Willie Smith represented possibility. He showed that a designer could be artistic, commercial, and socially aware at the same time. But behind the success, his life was moving toward a devastating final chapter. In the mid-1980s, the AIDS crisis was tearing through creative communities, especially in cities like New York. The disease carried not only physical danger, but also silence, fear, and public misunderstanding. Many people who became ill faced isolation at the exact moment they needed compassion most. On April 17, 1987, Willie Smith died at the age of 39. At first, the public explanation focused on pneumonia and other complications, but his death was later understood as AIDS-related. His passing shocked the fashion world because he was still young, still influential, and still full of ideas that had not yet reached their final form. Willie Smith's story belongs in this conversation because his impact stretched far beyond fashion. He helped shape the visual culture that surrounded music, nightlife, and street identity in the 1980s. AIDS took him at the peak of his creative power, but it did not erase what he built. His name remains tied to freedom, movement, and the belief that style should belong to everyone, not just the chosen few. Willie Ninja died age 45 in 2006. Willie Ninja was not just a dancer, he was a movement. Long before voguing became known across the world, Willie was already shaping it in the underground ballroom scene of New York City. With sharp lines, elegant poses, and a confidence that could command an entire room, he transformed dance into identity, survival, and power. Every movement told a story. Every pose looked like a challenge to a world that often tried to ignore people like him. Born William Roscoe Leake, he became known as the godfather of voguing, a title he earned not through luck, but through influence. He helped bring ballroom culture out of hidden spaces and into global visibility. To many, Willie Ninja was more than a performer. He was a teacher, a mentor, and a symbol of chosen family. In a community where rejection was painfully common, he created a space where people could stand tall, be seen, and feel beautiful. His rise became even more visible after the documentary Paris is Burning introduced ballroom culture to wider audiences. Willie's presence stood out immediately. He was graceful, controlled, and unforgettable. He moved like fashion, music, and attitude had all become one body. Soon, the wider entertainment world began to notice. His influence reached music videos, runways, fashion houses, and pop culture itself. But behind that legendary image was a life shaped by struggle. The ballroom world gave people freedom, but it also existed during a devastating era. HIV and AIDS were tearing through creative, queer, and black communities, often while the outside world looked away. For many, illness came with silence, fear, and isolation. Willie lived through that storm while continuing to inspire others with strength and style. On September 2, 2006, Willie Ninja died at the age of 45 from AIDS-related heart failure. His death was a deep loss, not only to dance, but to the culture he helped build. The man who had taught so many people how to walk with confidence was gone, but the language he helped shape did not disappear. Willie Ninja's legacy remains alive every time voguing appears on a stage, in a ballroom, on a runway, or in a music video. He proved that movement could be more than performance. It could be protection. It could be pride. It could be a declaration that even in a world full of judgment, you still have the right to be seen. Marlon Riggs died, age 37, in 1994. Marlon Riggs was not a mainstream celebrity in the usual sense, but his voice was one of the most courageous of his generation. He was a filmmaker, poet, professor, and artist who used the camera like a weapon against silence. At a time when black queer lives were often ignored, mocked, or pushed to the margins, Riggs insisted on telling the truth with beauty, anger, intelligence, and vulnerability. Born in Texas, Marlon grew up moving through different worlds, always aware of what it meant to be black in America and what it meant to be different in spaces that demanded silence. Instead of hiding from that tension, he turned it into art. His films explored race, sexuality, identity, desire, masculinity, and the pain of being judged by both society and sometimes even one's own community. His most famous works, including Tongues Untied, were bold because they refused to beg for permission. Riggs did not soften his message to make people comfortable. He showed black gay men as complex human beings, loving, angry, wounded, funny, political, sensual, and alive. That honesty made his work powerful, but it also made him a target. Critics attacked him. Public debates surrounded his films. Yet he kept creating because he understood that silence could be just as dangerous as hatred. During the AIDS crisis, Marlon Riggs faced the disease not as a distant issue, but as a reality inside his own life and community. He was HIV positive, and he chose to speak about illness, fear, survival, and dignity with rare openness. In an era when many people hid their diagnosis because stigma could destroy reputations, families, and careers, Riggs used his art to confront the shame directly. On April 5, 1994, Marlon Riggs died at the age of 37 from AIDS-related complications. He was young, brilliant, and still full of work that the world had not yet received. His death was heartbreaking because it came during a time when so many artists were being lost too soon, especially those who had already spent their lives fighting to be heard. But Marlon Riggs did not vanish. His films still speak. His words still challenge. His legacy remains in every artist who refuses to be erased, every storyteller who chooses honesty over safety, and every viewer who realizes that visibility can be an act of survival. Kenny Green died, age 32, in 2001. Kenny Green was the kind of talent whose name may not always be shouted first, but whose influence quietly lived inside the sound of 1990s R&B. As the lead singer of the group Intro, he helped create music that felt smooth, intimate, and deeply emotional. His voice carried the softness of love songs, but also the weight of someone who understood pain. For many fans, Kenny was not just another singer in a group. He was the soul behind the feeling. Intro arrived during a golden era of R&B, when harmony, romance, and vulnerability shaped the charts. Songs connected differently back then. They were not only made for radio, They were made for late nights, heartbreak, memories, and people trying to understand love. Kenny's voice fit perfectly into that world. He could make a simple line feel personal, as if he were singing directly to one person in the room. But Kenny Green's gift went beyond performing. He was also a songwriter, and his pen reached some of the biggest voices in R&B. One of his most important contributions was writing Love No Limit for Mary J. Blige, a song that became part of her early legacy. That alone shows how deeply Kenny understood the emotional language of soul music. He knew how to turn feeling into melody. Behind the scenes, however, his life was carrying a much heavier truth. Kenny was living with AIDS at a time when the disease still carried enormous stigma. For artists, especially black artists in R&B and hip-hop culture, speaking openly about illness could bring judgment, gossip, and isolation. Many people suffered quietly, protecting their image while their bodies were fighting something the public barely understood. Kenny eventually became one of the few artists connected to the R&B world who publicly acknowledged his condition. That honesty mattered. It turned his story from private tragedy into a painful reminder of how many talented people were affected by the AIDS crisis. On October 1, 2001, Kenny Green died at the age of 32 from AIDS-related complications. He was still young, still gifted, and still connected to a musical future that should have been much longer. His death was heartbreaking because it took not only a singer, but a creator. Kenny Green left behind songs, memories, and proof that some of the most powerful voices in music are not always the loudest. Sometimes, they are the ones that stay with you quietly, long after the final note fades. Melvin Lindsay died, age 36, in 1992. Melvin Lindsay was not a traditional singer, but his impact on R&B was undeniable. He did not need a microphone to sing a hit record, because his voice reached people in another way. As a radio host, he helped shape the sound, mood, and emotional atmosphere of late-night black radio. For many listeners, Melvin was the calm voice in the dark, the person who made music feel personal, intimate, and safe. He became closely associated with the Quiet Storm format, a style of radio built around smooth R&B, soul, romance, and late-night emotion. It was not just a playlist. It was a feeling. The songs flowed slowly, the mood stayed warm, and the listener felt as if the whole world had gone quiet except for the music. Melvin Lindsay helped turn that atmosphere into a cultural experience. In Washington, D.C., and beyond, his presence on air became deeply familiar. People listened while driving home, lying awake, falling in love, or trying to heal from heartbreak. His voice connected songs together like a thread, making the night feel less lonely. That was his gift. He understood that radio was not only about playing records, it was about creating companionship. But behind the smooth voice and public recognition, Melvin was facing a devastating private battle. During the late 1980s and early 1990s, HIV and AIDS were still surrounded by fear, misinformation, and cruel judgment. Many people affected by the disease were forced to carry their pain in silence, because the public often reacted with suspicion instead of compassion. Melvin Lindsay became ill during this painful period. His health declined, while his reputation remained tied to warmth, romance, and music. The contrast was heartbreaking. The man who had comforted so many listeners was now facing an illness that few people knew how to talk about openly. On March 26, 1992, Melvin Lindsay died at the age of 36. His death was linked to complications from AIDS, cutting short a career that had already changed the sound of radio. Melvin's legacy is different from that of a singer or stage performer, but it is no less important. He helped define how generations experienced R&B after dark. He gave songs a setting, a mood, and a memory. Even after his passing, the Quiet Storm format continued to influence radio, playlists, and romantic R&B culture. Melvin Lindsay proved that sometimes the voice between the songs can become just as unforgettable as the music itself. Wayne Cooper died, age 29 in 1984. Wayne Cooper was one of those voices that helped give funk and R&B their shine in the late 1970s and early 1980s. As a vocalist connected to Cameo, he became part of a sound that was bold, stylish, and full of movement. Cameo's music had rhythm, attitude, and personality. It was built for the stage, for the dance floor, and for listeners who wanted funk to feel sharp and alive. Wayne's voice added color to that world. He was not always the most widely discussed name in popular music, but within the funk and R&B scene, his presence mattered. Groups like Cameo were not just making songs, they were creating a full identity. The music had fashion, confidence, groove, and a sense of performance that helped shape black music culture during that era. For young artists, that kind of success could feel limitless. The stage lights, touring, studio sessions, and attention created an image of excitement. But the early 1980s were also the beginning of a terrifying new chapter in health history. AIDS was emerging, but the public understood very little. Rumors spread faster than facts. Fear often replaced sympathy. Many people who became sick did not have the language, support, or medical options that would come later. Wayne Cooper's final years remain less publicly documented than those of some other major stars from the era, which makes his story feel even more shadowed. What is remembered is that he died young, before his talent had the chance to reach its full future. In the transcript, his death is connected to AIDS complications, placing him among artists whose lives were cut short during the earliest and most frightening years of the epidemic. On October 15, 1984, Wayne Cooper died at the age of 29. For fans of Cameo and funk music, his passing represented the kind of loss that can happen before the wider world even fully realizes what has been taken. Wayne Cooper's story is painful because it reminds us how many artists from that period were never given the time, visibility, or public mourning they deserved. Some became legends with headlines. Others became names, remembered mostly by devoted fans and music historians. But influence is not always measured by fame alone. Sometimes it lives in a voice, a stage memory, a groove, or a song that still carries the energy of a life ended far too soon. The tragic epidemic of the 80s and 90s left behind an era of heartbreaking contradictions, where the brightest beacons of vocal greatness were forced to navigate unimaginable agony in the shadows. Paralyzed by relentless societal stigma and suffocating industry pressure, these extraordinary icons carried the heavy, devastating burden of fighting their darkest and final hours in complete silence and heartbreaking isolation. Yet, no amount of pain, secrecy, or tragic cover-ups can ever diminish the sheer magnitude of their artistic brilliance. While their physical lives were cut far too short by a merciless disease, their unmatched soul, electrifying talent, and monumentally foundational contributions to R&B and black culture will forever remain timeless, untouchable, and immortal. Which of these heartbreaking stories struck you the deepest, and which of these legendary artists still gets heavy rotation on your playlists today? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Hit that like button, subscribe to Hollywood Uncut, and ring the notification bell for more unvarnished true stories.